I don't want to be a product of my environment. I want my environment to be a product of me.
So this is Carl Nickel and Gary Holmes here with Rico and Mike from Source Find Asia. Today we're going to be talking about 5 things everyone needs to know when manufacturing your own product in China. We're going to be covering topics such as research, creating physical samples, finding a supplier, having multiple contacts at the factory, and going through quality control. So Gary Holmes, you're going to be taking us away with some questions.
This is very official intro. This is very serious.
Serious tone.
I feel like we should put on a tie right now.
Yeah, we got the 2 best haircuts in Guangzhou right here. They're awesome. So first, let's get into the research. How much research do we actually have to do if you want to make a product in China? Is it just a quick Google search? Do we need a few details? What is the extent?
I think the more you know about your product, the more successful you're going to be, the easier it is going to be for you to find the right supplier, to find the right materials. During the production process, the more you know about how something is made and where the materials are coming from and the steps involved in the production process, most likely the more successful you're going to be and the less hang-ups you're going to have along the way.
Yeah, and especially when you have products that have never been made before. A lot of times people come up with the concept and think, I'm going to make it in China. But when you actually start to do research into how you're going to make this thing and the different parts that go into it, it might not be realistic. It might be too expensive. For example, we've talked about the coolest cooler, right? They had a hugely successful campaign. I'm not biting them at whatever, but they made over 20 million, I think.
Yeah, something like that.
13? Maybe I'm exaggerating,
over
but
10.
It was millions. And they were delayed by a significantly long period because their product was very intricate and hasn't been done before. Maybe the factory doesn't know how to make it. Maybe they have a lot of issues along the way. So it's very important that you know if your product is realistic and how much it's going to cost to be made.
Cool. So in terms of the materials, is there is there any definitive way that what it is you need? For example, if you're just starting out, let's say you don't have a lot of design experience, you just have a really nice idea. How sure do you have to be about a certain material going in? Do you have to know 100%, or is it something where you can get suggestions from somebody else?
I think you can get suggestions. I think it depends on what you're making. But if I'm somebody who has an idea for a product, I'm not really sure about the design aspects, I'll try to find something similar to it. If I'm making, anything, I'll just try to find a sample of something that's similar to it and then get suggestions from somebody who's more knowledgeable about different materials that could be used for that product. So it depends on what you're making, but yeah, you can have a rough idea and then find somebody else to give you suggestions.
Yeah, I agree. Especially when you're manufacturing in China, I think me and Rico have touched on this before. Having that physical sample prior to approaching the factory means a lot. It speeds up the process significantly, and you should have experimented with different materials prior to taking it to the factory, in my opinion. And you could do just like Rico said, talk to other people who might be more knowledgeable than you about the topic, or locate other similar products that you like. Maybe one's not perfect, but maybe one aspect of one product, one aspect of another product. You can bring both samples to the factory and explain that to them moving forward.
I mean, that kind of goes back to the last point when we were talking about how realistic it is to make something. The process of making a sample, if you see how difficult it is to make a physical sample, you might want to reconsider mass producing that product. So like Mike was saying, it's important to get physical samples, as you design it. If you're making a Kickstarter campaign, for example, you might be able to get 3D renderings, and you can use that. And as you're building your campaign, you want to be finishing up the design, figuring out how you can actually make this thing.
Right. So for people who don't know, like, what is a sample versus like a prototype?
What is a sample versus a prototype? Are you saying a 3D rendering? When you're talking
Yeah,
about
in
prototype?
terms of, let's say I have a good idea for a watch. It's not 100%. Let's say it's like 80% done in terms of what I have a good idea of what I want it to be. Maybe it's like the right design, maybe not, but not quite finished in terms of the perfect material.
Yeah,
Is that good enough?
Yeah, if just what's the difference between the two terms?
Yeah.
I mean, in our world, they're kind of interchangeable.
Yeah.
You know, you can say this is the first run sample, this is the final sample. You know, I think they're synonyms. You know, if I looked it up in Webster's, it might tell me something different. But you know, for what we do, yeah, it's pretty much the same thing. You know, a prototype might be a drawing, or like Rico said, a 3D render.
That's what I was thinking about. It's like a 3D prototype. You know.
Yeah, so it sounds like the important thing is that it has to get to a certain point, and it doesn't really matter what you call it, as long as it's like by the end of, let's say, a certain date, it's 100% done, and that's what we're going to copy in terms of how it's going to manufacture in the company. Cool. So
just one other point I wanted to hit on before we move off of physical samples. A lot of factories don't actually, sometimes they don't work off of the actual CAD files. So some people think that they can make a CAD file and have that and give it to the factory, and it explains how this product should be made, what are the specs and all that. But a lot of factories just want to work off of a physical sample. So that's another reason why it's important to have a perfect physical sample that you can give to the factories and just say, I want you to make this exactly the same, a million times over.
So what percent of those factories would you think like not take a CAD file, for example?
Would you not use the CAD? They all take them, but I wouldn't know the percentage of.
No, it depends on the product and what they're doing. Some products or industries or particular factories, that's very common for them. Mm-hmm. Others, maybe no. But I think the more professional factories you work with, the more likelihood that they'll accept CAD files.
I was about to touch on that. Like if you're working with a larger manufacturer, one that's a little bit more professional, you're paying a higher price point. You can always tell when you physically go to the factories and how the factory looks and just everything that's going on, how professional they are. Most likely they will use the CAD file. And most likely they will be checking every step of the way to make sure that they're doing everything properly.
Okay, so let's say we've got a physical product now. Mm-hmm. We've got our prototype on hand. How do I actually go about finding a manufacturer? How do I actually go about finding someone to make this product for me? How do I go about finding a supplier?
Well, the simplest way is Alibaba. I think anyone that's kind of vaguely familiar with China would know about Alibaba. You can obviously you can use a purchasing agent, sourcing agent. If you know somebody in China, they could help you. Did I miss anything?
No, I mean, if you're here or you know people here, obviously you can reference friends, ask other people their opinion on where to go to find things. But yeah, there's online resources where you can find massive amounts of factories in a matter of minutes, whether it's Alibaba or made in China. Even to a lesser extent, you could, at least for reference sake, you could use Taobao. Taobao's pretty good to find products, narrow down where they might be in China. So Alibaba's the go-to for sure.
So for anybody that doesn't know what Taobao is, it's essentially eBay in China. That's what it is.
Yeah. Or like, I guess you could say like a cross between eBay and Amazon even.
Yeah.
It's just a giant online marketplace that has absolutely anything in the world.
Okay. So when you're looking for a supplier, is there any benefits to choosing a specific location? For instance, is there any benefit to finding a supplier that's going to be based in Beijing versus Guangzhou?
I think it's huge, to be honest. I've been out here a long time. I've been working with suppliers from all over China, and I mean, unless it's absolutely impossible, or I find a killer factory in another province, I try to always work with suppliers out of Guangdong province. We're based in Guangzhou, so whether it be Guangzhou, Foshan, Dongguan, Shenzhen, or some of the smaller surrounding cities, just makes it so much easier. If you're out here or you're working with someone who's out here, you want to have the ability to check on the products, to do quality control, to do spot checks, to verify what they're telling you is actually happening. And if you're based in Shenzhen, but the factory's all the way up in Harbin or Beijing, that's unless you have the budget for it, that's kind of a pain in the ass, because you're taking flights whenever you have to go out there, versus a factory that might be in Dongguan, we can take a 30-minute cab or even a fast train to get there.
Okay.
Yeah, and like Mike was saying, one thing I'm going to touch on probably a couple times in this episode and in the future of the podcast is that doing business in China is about mitigating risk. Like, you're always going to be, there's always going to be a certain level of risk, but you can mitigate it through certain ways, which is doing your research up front, right? Giving physical samples. And then now, if you talk about location, if you have a supplier that you can easily access and you can pop over, or your sourcing agent can easily access that supplier, they're less likely to maybe, delay things. They're less likely to try and mess around with you a bit, right? So just mitigating risk, being able to pop over to the factory whenever you want to, not worrying about shipping, not worrying about, the difficulty of shipping your product from this place because it's in a remote area. Right?
Okay. And so just for listeners, can you guys give us an idea of how often do you guys visit these factories? I mean, let's say I do find someone that I really want to work with in Beijing. How often would you say I'd have to go visit them?
It depends on the project. What you're doing, how communication's going. Somebody who's super consistent with communication, you might feel a little bit less of a need to constantly visit them. Some suppliers we work with will shoot you messages on WeChat every day, showing you progress, letting you know updates, and they're the aggressor, if you will, with the communication about the project. So in that case, you wouldn't have to go quite as much. And then, once you're making multiple orders, you probably won't have to go quite as much either. If you're making the same product you just made an order for last month, they're probably going to have a much better idea of how to do it than, for that first run. So I would say it's kind of like a sliding scale. At first, you're going to have to go a little bit more, make sure everything's smooth, make sure, they're hitting all the details of the product that you need. And then, as you move on, you won't have to go and visit quite as much. But I think I will say, sorry to cut you off, Rico. I think it's important in China. I think it's important in China to always maintain some sort of contact, and I think FaceTime in China is more important than other places I've lived. And what also I've noticed, like during Chinese New Year, sometimes is factories are super busy. Number one. Everybody's trying to plug their orders before Chinese New Year. Employees are leaving earlier and earlier each year, sometimes for good, without telling the factory. And orders get backed up. And if you aren't there, if you aren't present, if you aren't pushing them, there's a very good chance that your order is going to get pushed back versus someone who's there in their face, making sure that things are actually going through. Mm-hmm. So I think, being there and being present is a really big thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, like Mike said, it depends on the project. I would say if you're making a product that's new, you're gonna have to make molds, right? So maybe a good rule of thumb would be having certain points in the project that you want to hit. So you have the beginning, going to vet the factory. You want to visit and see the factory before you sign a contract, before you pay a deposit. Then when you're making the mold, maybe you want to visit the factory after you finish the mold. When you start production, you might want to go see the factory during production if you don't pay a QC company to do that for you. And then, of course, the last part would be just at the end of production, before they ship them out, you want to go to the factory one last time. So that in that situation, I would say rule of thumb, new product, if you have to make molds, 3 to 4 times. Before the project starts, 2 times in between, and then the 3rd time is towards that.
That's just a reference, though.
Yeah.
Could be more, could be less.
Depending on, like Mike was saying, if they're communicative, if you're seeing what's going on, if they're sending you pictures, then that could be a good rule of thumb. If they're not, then sometimes you have to pop over to the factory. Like we had a toy that we're making recently, and there were a lot of issues in the beginning with communication. And I remember at some stage Mike had to go to Shenzhen, like just randomly, and just show up at the factory because we were asking them questions. They were not replying. They were taking 3 days to reply, and it wasn't part of the plan. If things were going smoothly, we wouldn't have to do that, but we just had to go there, pop over. Which actually brings me to my next point: is you need a good idea would be to have multiple contacts at the factory.
Yeah, definitely.
So if you have your sales guy, and your sales guy all of a sudden becomes unresponsive, if you have somebody else, like maybe you're talking to the engineer who's actually making your product, then you can reach out to that person. And a lot of times, honestly, the salesperson is just going to take that question and go to the engineer and ask, right? So if you can talk directly to the engineer, maybe the salesperson, maybe a sales manager, that's a good idea.
So it sounds like whenever you have an innate gut feeling that you need to talk to someone because like the flow is off in some sort of way, that's a really good time to make a move.
Yeah, I think instinct's a big part of it for sure, but it takes a while to develop that instinct.
Mm-hmm.
Your first time producing something in China, you might not have a feeling that something they're doing is off or strange. But when you ran 20 different orders with 20 different factories, then you're going to start to notice certain communication patterns or certain delays that are more concerning than others.
Just realistically, how responsive can they be? First of all, like what's the most responsive person you've ever had? And then
if you've been in China, there's a very, very, very small percentage of the population that doesn't have their telephone next to them every second of the damn day.
Yeah.
And every time that phone goes off, they pick it up. I've had people answer phone calls in the most inappropriate times you've ever seen to talk about nothing. Oh, I'm here. I'm over here at this place. And not like, I gotta go, bye. Just no, they'll stay on the damn phone for 3 minutes. So if somebody's not picking up and not responding to you, in my opinion, if you have a legitimate question, if it takes more than 24 hours, I'm concerned. Even if they say, "Hey, I'm really busy today," that's adequate. But I think that's all those salespeople do. They're not on the factory floor getting their hands dirty. Their job is to communicate with the clients. So I think it should be immediate, if not, within the next day, max 2 days that you're getting a response. And unless it's something super important, then it should be within, as soon as they see the phone.
Yeah, and I have like one salesperson I'm working with right now. I'll send her an email that I'm expecting her to reply the next day. I'll send her an email like 2 o'clock in the morning. She replies in like 30 minutes. And I'm like, what are you still doing awake right now? But, that's the level sometimes that people are at. And then you have some other people that might take longer. But generally, like Mike said, I think 24 hours would be a good rule of thumb. And you can gauge it as well, because what I don't like, this is something I really don't like about some factories, is in the beginning they'll be super responsive, which I understand if you're trying to close a deal. But then if mid-project you start like taking such a long time to reply to me and there's sort of the relationship changes, I don't like that with certain sales stuff.
Yeah, so it sounds like just like use common sense, if they're responding, great. If they're not, start worrying.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
They're acting,
Yeah.
Have backups, have somebody else at the factory, go confront them,
But it's just in general, somebody might go on vacation. So
Sure.
It's just have a backup. So I guess that goes to the last point.
Yeah, so the final point we have is with quality control. Can you guys tell us a little bit about what that is, what it entails for you? What does that mean to you guys?
Well, different spot checks. Quality control. You just want to make sure that your product is being made properly. You want to, for example, just have certain points in the project where you check, what's going on. Like some people will pay a QC company and they'll go in at, I think during production most of the time against like 3 times or 2 times. They'll go after the first 20%, I believe, or have been manufactured, and then the last like 90% when 90% are done. So you just have different spot checks. Don't trust pictures. A lot of times pictures will lie. I think Mike has a story about one of his buddies who was like paid a ton of money off of some pictures on WeChat. Do you remember that?
That sounds crazy.
You remember?
Okay.
That sounds like a
So I mean,
Just when I say don't trust pictures, it's just, you're communicating with these factories via WeChat, which is like WhatsApp, and maybe they're making your product, and then they're during production, and the guy I'm talking
about now.
So during production, they're making your product, and they're sending you pictures. Hey, we just made 100, and they send you nice looking samples and whatever. But then if you pay off of those pictures, they might have just been showing you a choice amount of toys or products, whatever it is. And then when you actually see the full production, it's not what you're expecting, or they didn't make what you're expecting. So I think Mike remembers the story now.
No, it was just that. It was actually a sourcing agent I know who's in Guangdong province. They had a big old order, man. I mean, this was no small potatoes. And it was for boots that they're sending back to Canada, I believe. And he showed me all the pictures, and they paid all the money down based off these pictures. And when I saw them, I mean, they looked good. It was like, you saw the racks of the shoe soles, and you saw a couple racks of completed products. But, I think they ordered a couple thousand pairs of boots, and there was probably about 80 in the picture. So it gave you the sense that they were actually doing something, but when they paid all the money, the factory was nowhere to be found, which isn't a completely uncommon story out here. And also with QC, to go back to the first point about how much research you should do, you should have some idea of how the product's made, because then you can know at what point to do quality control checks. For example, I had these PU handbags, like a woman's handbag, and it's a flat, small looking handbag, and we made them, I don't know, let's just say, for example, 500 pieces, and 200 of the pieces were printed and the other 300 were not, but the client wanted to print on them at a later date. But what I didn't communicate that adequately to the factory, so they made the 300 completely. But what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to have two parts for the printing, two separate pieces to the bag, you understand? So you're supposed to press down on the printing, and then once the printing's done, you can sew the bag together.
Right.
So if I would have done more research to know that, and I would have communicated that better with the factory, I could have gone at the right time for the quality control check, rather than when all the bags were completed. So, these things are stuff you got to take into consideration.
Yeah, and Mike just reminded me when he was talking about knowing how your product is made and knowing the materials. So, for example, if you're making a product from PVC, which is a type of plastic, you should give yourself some sort of leeway, because a lot of times when you make PVC material products, PVC has a tendency, especially with intricately designed parts, has a tendency to shrink. So if you are looking to make something and then you make it out of PVC and you go to the factory and some of them are shrunk, and you're going like, oh my god, I can't believe this. If you knew about PVC beforehand, maybe you wouldn't use that material to make your product, right? So it goes back to that when we're talking about quality control. Give yourself some space. If you have the kind of money, maybe you want to order, instead of just ordering 5,000 units, order like 5,500. So maybe 400 of those, not 400, but like a certain percentage of those might not be up to standard. And then you're not worrying about fulfilling your customer's order, right?
Okay. So let's say I want to outsource the quality control aspect to my business. How do I find a quality control company? Is my sourcing agent able to take care of this for me? How do I go about doing that?
Now, that's going to depend on your budget. It's also going to depend on what you're making. I think certain products require, professional consultants in terms of doing QC testing. When you're shipping a product that's like to the States and Canada, there's regulations, right? So if you're shipping a plastic, if you're selling it to children, if you're selling it to a different age, it depends on the product. You need to have certain standards met, and a sourcing agent will probably be able to connect you to a QC company, but
they aren't a QC company.
They're not the QC company, right? So it just depends on your price point. If you have like a small sample order of, I just did QC on prescription glasses, I wasn't inspecting the actual lens. I was inspecting the wood frame. That's fine. It was 100 pieces. It wasn't a big deal. I can do a report on that adequately. I know the process on doing that. But if he said to me, "Hey, can you inspect the lens to make sure that it's done?" I would say, "No, that's not what I do. You'd probably want to find a professional company to do that for you." Right?
Very, very often QC is worth it. It's worth it. It's so much better to pay a little more money up front to make sure that you have what you want prior to paying for it than paying for it and realizing you have something that isn't exactly what you wanted, or even worse, paying for something that isn't exactly what you wanted, then sending it across the world, delivering it to your customers, and then realizing it's not what you wanted. That's when things get super ugly. So that initial upfront money that you might pay for a QC company oftentimes is well worth it.
Okay, so let's say that I do want to hire a QC company. Where can I go about doing this? Is that as simple as a Google search, or is there an online resource I can use? Where do I go?
I think if it depends on the materials, it depends on your product. If you do a little bit of research on Google and say, let's go back to glasses. If you say there's some certain, if you're talking about optical lenses, there's some certain requirements that the government has before you ship those. I would go to that official government website. Sometimes they have recommendations on QC companies. So a company that does testing for plastics is SGS. If you go to SGS's website, they will have recommendations for QC companies that you can work with in China, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, wherever, right? And they also list out the standards that you need to hit to ship to the company, to the country that you're shipping to. So that would be my recommendation, is do a quick Google search on the materials being used in your product. What are the standards that you need to hit in order to ship to your country? And basically what should they be checking for? And you can find recommendations for QC companies off of that.
So then when you pair with these companies, let's say you find a sourcing agent, you find a QC guy, in terms of the sales agreement, is that good enough once you have it on paper? Is there anything else that you have to do on top of that to succeed?
Sales agreement, Mike told me before, is like, yeah, it's good to sign it, it's good to detail what's going on, but this is China, TIC, hashtag this is China.
This is China.
You have a contract, they should honor it. A good manufacturer should honor it, but you have to make sure things are being done properly. You can't just sign a contract and assume that they're going to honor it. If your product, you're probably not going to get a refund. So it's a guideline more so than as something that you should rely on.
It's more of a paper that says, all right, we're going to be talking with each other and we're going to be working with each other, but it sounds like there's a little bit more.
In my opinion, the sales agreement or the contract that you might sign with the factory is helpful because it's like a visual for both parties that kind of outlines how things are supposed to progress. Doesn't mean that either party is going to fulfill that. It just, it's kind of like an outline. It's a plan for the project. Yeah,
just use your sales agreement as a guideline. It's important. It is important to sign it. It is important to go through the details with the factory and saying like, okay, this is what we want done for this. This is an acceptable defect rate. This is unacceptable. This we're going to pay at this point of the project and X, Y, and Z. If the products are inadequate, what are we doing? Are you refunding? Are we not paying for that, or are you remanufacturing that product? So it's like a guideline.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's say, for example, like shit hits the fan, you bring out your sales agreement. Is it something that you should come in angry with? Is it like, what is the cultural standard that is accepted?
I mean, it depends on the situation. I mean, what is the person doing?
Let's say you're a new guy, right? You quite don't know what you're doing. You have this sales agreement. You're used to, let's say, Western practices where that is the law, right? That's absolutely what happens. And let's say you pull this off in China, you have your little sales agreement in your hand, you go up to the factory and you're like, hey, we're supposed to do this, and this.
You have a piece of paper in your hand.
Exactly.
That's not necessarily gonna do much. I mean, I've been here forever, and I have very little idea even about how to go about trying to take legal action against someone. And the people that I do know that have done that, the only people I know that have been successful have completely outsourced it to someone else, to a Chinese company, and it takes forever. It costs a lot of money, and oftentimes, you're wasting time in the meantime.
Yeah, the amount of time and energy you're going to spend chasing that it's probably not worth it. It's probably just better to, take your loss and then try and find a better supplier.
Yeah,
that's it.
So I mean, that just puts more emphasis on your initial research, finding a legit factory who has a large number of clients, and especially foreign clients, and has a good reputation, has been around a while, has evidence of their work online, it communicates very well. You go to their factory, they have multiple departments that are all working. They have a separate sales department, they have a separate QC team, all these things. You can see them working, you can see their process in action. Those are all good steps to take in order to avoid that type of situation.
Yeah, and going back to Mike's point, in terms of when you visit a factory and you're vetting the suppliers, it's good to figure if, in terms of checking departments, it's good to know that everything is being done in-house, as they say it is. So, for example, with molds, a lot of factories don't tell you that they don't make the molds on site. They might outsource that to another factory.
That's very common also on Alibaba, is finding people, maybe they take on one aspect of the factory, or they're just agents, and they're outsourcing the products to different factories, and that's a good way to screw things up.
Mm-hmm. Let's say a factory is outsourcing the mold. That's not necessarily the end of the world, but you want to know where the mold is being made.
Right.
So they should give you the contact information for that factory, and maybe even go visit that factory just to make sure that it is a factory, right? So just knowing when you go there, if they're honest with you, you ask them questions. Quite often I've been to factories and I'll ask them questions, and then they'll be like, "Oh, do you feel cold today?" I'm like, "Well, did you answer my question? Where are you making molds? Are you hungry? What? Just answer the question, And that's always a bad sign. Like if they're hiding something, you can just kind of gauge with that.
So just do your homework and be careful. It sounds like the more work you do up front, the less stern you have to be in the future.
It's not rocket science, people.
Yeah, just basic business practice.
Understanding the culture, understanding Chinese culture, and that's gonna help you a ton as well. I think that's it. What do you think of that episode? Was good?
Yeah,
it's a wrap.
Thank you, gents.
Pleasure.
Master interviewers that work hard. We appreciate it. All right, guys, appreciate you listening, and tune in next time.
Yeah, so if you want to find us, that's info@sourcefindasia.com, sourcefindasia.com, and we have Twitter @sourcefindasia, Instagram @sourcefindasia, Facebook.com sourcefindasia. You guessed it. Thanks to everyone that's reviewed the podcast so far. I'm so happy that we're on noteworthy this within 24 hours. I'm gonna do post-production. You probably heard that already. I shouted out all the people that reviewed us. Let's keep it going. I'm happy, and I think that we can provide a ton of value going forward. So, cheers. What's up, YouTube? Thanks for watching the video. If you like this kind of content, I have a special gift for you. It's called the Definitive Sourcing Guide Arsenal. It's our 4-step sourcing guide. The link is in the description below. Of course, we also have the Made in China podcast at sourcefindasia.com/made in China. Link is in the description below. And of course, subscribe.